everybody. I'd just like to obviously explain. I'm here to discuss about the API journey for the MYOB AccountRight Live. Why do I think I can come here and talk to you about this? And we'll find out this doesn't work now. Why is that not going to work? There we go. Who knows? So why do I think I can talk to you here? Well, before I describe about that, I'll just describe who I am. I'm Shaun Wilde, and I work at MYOB. I'm senior developer on the MYOB API. We get t-shirts. And part of it is the AccountRight Live team. And that's my email address. You can spam me if you want. Help yourself. And here we go. There's always one. And what else do I do? Well, I'm also doing some open source development. Always have to give this one a plug because I don't think enough people use it. On OpenCover, which is an open source code coverage tool, and there's some bits there. And it's on GitHub, and you can all use it. And you can download it from GitHub, as I say. It's on NuGet, so you can plug it into your build system at any time. And it's also integrated with Sharp Develop, which is an IDE, an open source IDE for .NET. So somebody thinks it's good. Here we go. Right, so why do I think I can talk to you? Okay. Recently we had this coming from a customer, which obviously said, integrated with the MYOB API has been so quick for us. For example, when MYOB API let us know when the new endpoints were available, for payroll, they could complete a full depth integration in the space of 16 hours. And I thought to myself, that's not bad. What did we do? What did we get right? Obviously, there's a lot of things we probably got wrong along the way. But what did we get right that they had got them to do that there? So I thought I'll try and explain what we did, and hopefully some of the lessons we learnt, if you're thinking of doing your own API, you may be able to take them on board or dismiss them. Okay. So what is AccountRight Live? Well, apparently it's an accounting package. You may have all heard of us. So there we go. It works on and offline, and we have to make the API work on and offline as well, which is a whole heap of stuff I'm not going to go into here. I'm going to talk about the actual API design itself. So about the API itself. Okay, there's a lot there. It's been in development for over 2 years now, with a development team that grows and shrinks depending on demand. We've also got a dedicated client support team who not just deal with our API, but they deal with the API for Essentials and other MYOB products, as well as the old ODBC driver that I know some people here have had to use. Ooh, myself there. Version 1 was released in February 2013 with only 12 resources. Quite a lightweight, but we realised very early on, even after those 12 resources, we'd made a lot of mistakes. And that's probably why I'm here. So then we went with version 2, and now we have up to over the period of 12 months since version 2 has been released, we've exposed over nearly 60 plus resources. So we're doing like one plus a week. This is like invoices, orders, accounts, general ledger, most things that people want to deal with an accountancy package. We have desktop and cloud installations. We obviously regularly can deliver patches to the cloud, so we've got nice continuous delivery, give or take, the odd days and there and there. And obviously we have to deliver the product to the desktop on, big release cycles and CDs being made and that sort of stuff. And we have lots of registered keys from our developer partners, over 50 cloud integrations, and we even have our own internal products such as PayDirect, which you may have heard of. That's all been in the adverts nowadays, and pay by credit card, and that all uses the API as well. And that's got a zoom on there. I forgot about that. Okay. So getting started. If people actually want to use it, we have a developer portal, and I'll talk about this bit later. But there's a little developer portal we have where you can get your keys. And I'm just going to show a quick demo, if this works, of using the API, of what an application that uses the API and sort of stuff that you can probably do with it. So hopefully this works. Right. So I need to log in first, so you don't see my password. Now, we use OAuth, so I have to do this. Perils of working with computers for the past God knows how many years. I'm sure most of you will have been there. Okay, right. So we have this is a simple Windows Phone application that we've written that we use as a sample to just demonstrate to people how to use the API. Okay, so just show some of the functionality that's available, obviously just through an application. It's a very lightweight, obviously. So we obviously show people on how to actually use OAuth to sign into the application. So we can log through and we list a set of company files. These are like your accountancy for a particular company. As you see, we've got loads of sandbox demos for when people come on as a developer that they can play with, so they don't have to have with subscriptions and all that sort of thing. This is the latest one released. The default password is obviously very obvious. Okay. And obviously, I just pulled back all the accounts to see what the balances are. The well-known screen known as Who Owes Me Money is very popular to find out who owes you the most money. And we also obviously, so you can list the invoices, and we supply ability to actually produce them as a PDF. And hopefully there we go. And it worked. There we go. So people can obviously download PDFs all through the API as well. So that sort of describes sort of the functionality that is sort of available through the API at a lightweight level. So, and there we go. Right. Okay, so before I talk about how we design the API, I thought I'd do a quick overview of what is REST. Now, it's quite... Talking about REST can cause all sorts of arguments. So I'm going to see whether I can do it the right way or just do a lightweight overview. So those of you who don't know what REST is will have a sort of an idea, and those who do know what REST is aren't angry. Okay. Right, so the approach. Ask the evangelist. Right. When you're actually doing REST, you've got two camps. There's people who really are in there, and REST is the thing. We must do it this way, and there is only one way to do REST. And then there are people who are a bit more pragmatic about it. And there's nothing wrong with being an evangelist, and you'll get 90% of your stuff done. But sometimes you just have to just step back a little bit and be more, pragmatic. So do a bit of pragmatism. Sometimes being that evangelist will get you there. It'll keep you on the right track. But sometimes you just, let's say, take a step back and just get the job done. So the academic version, no one can talk about REST without mentioning this fella, which is Roy Fielding, and it's off his dissertation. And apparently all the people who really follow his things are known as Restafarians, apparently. Never heard of them before. And the good stuff apparently is in chapter 5. And I have read it a long time ago, and I'm probably not going to read it for a long time again. Okay, so the key REST principles. What is REST about? What's it trying to do? Every resource is to have an identifier. So you can find something. It's fairly obvious. You connect your resources. So this is when they talk about hypermedia and that sort of stuff. So your resources from one entity to another are obvious, so they can be connected, and you give the full identifiers to find them. Use standard methods. Don't make things up. Don't create an action for every tiny little thing. Support multiple representations. Here they're talking about versioning. They're talking about JSON or XML, or even in the case of the demonstration, PDF. Right? It's all a representation of that entity. Communicate statelessly. That's quite a funny one, really, because the entities themselves will be stateless. You shouldn't keep state, but you always end up with state in some way or form, whether it's in your authentication tokens, whether it's your OAuth sort of stuff. But that's not what they talk about. They talk about the state of the entity itself to try and make sure that doesn't carry any states of operations. It doesn't mean you can't use optimistic locking. So if someone's changed the entity before you've got there, fail them. It just means that you don't, if somebody repeats the operation multiple times, you don't do really bad things or do the wrong thing beyond the one call. Some people don't like that. We as an accountancy package, where we like to know what money is in our accounts, we don't want things being applied multiple times and it all going horribly wrong. So we need to know what the state is. So we have a bit of state, but we try to avoid it as much as possible. So implementation. Okay. I picked this off Wikipedia. And they describe here, obviously, the common definition of what REST is. And they talk about being create, read, update, and delete. So server using simple HTTP calls. And that is how 90% of us will do it. That's how what 90% of your API, if you're using REST, will be. It'll just be create, read, update, delete of entities in and out your system, whether it's to a database or whether it's to something else or other systems. But it also causes problems because everyone just thinks it's CRUD. And it isn't just CRUD, but it can end up being just CRUD. And especially if you follow some of the documentation out there, they will just do it as CRUD. But you want to try and avoid it. But most of your REST systems will be CRUD. That's the best way to describe it. Okay. So the verbs. This is sort of what we talk about. Post, get, put, delete. There's your CRUD. So you post, you get, you put, you delete. Very simple. And most people use those operations all the time. There's some other ones back there. There's head and patch and options, and you'll see those get used as well. You'll find head get used for people just to see if your entity's still there. Patch, we haven't used it yet. We're looking to use it. That's really to do partial updates. But again, trying to do a partial update when someone's already updated an entity and you don't want, especially when it comes to that account balances and money, you want to be really careful in that area. And options, well, we don't, again, you'll probably find that when people are, you probably put some options ahead, especially when you're doing calls and that sort of thing, which is like a JavaScript way of doing cross-origin resource sharing. Yeah. Response codes. Use the HTTP response codes to describe what you're going to do. So use your success ones, use your redirection ones. So 304, I think, is not modified. Use 404 for not found, if it's something's already been deleted, and use the off server error. So again, we're not reinventing anything here. It's using what we already use in the web to get the job done. We use the headers. So we can use content type and accept. So we can use this to control what sort of representation we want our resource to be in. So whether it's in JSON or XML, we can use that, or what versions we want to support. We can use authorization headers. We can use if modified since to control the 304, so we can use that for caching and that sort of thing. So again, we're using the infrastructure of the internet to actually do the work for us, some of the heavy lifting for us. And URL or URI. This is how do you identify. So URI identifiers, URL refers to as locators, but as I say, all URLs are URIs. So I'm told. Okay. So using a URL to actually identify a resource is not a bad thing, and you'll see that all over. You'll see it on Facebook, you'll see it on Twitter, you'll see it everywhere where people see using REST-based APIs. Okay. So building an API. Right. Some things to consider. I'm not going to be able to cover everything, but these are the discussion which I want to talk more about rather than the rest stuff. What will be in your API? This is sometimes probably the hardest thing you're going to have. We spend countless hours standing around whiteboards with JSON on the thing and discussing what's going to go into our API, what functionality we're going to expose, who wants what our dev partners are wanting. Can everybody do the functionality that they want to do when we expose an API? And this is really worth thinking about before you just go barging on and exposing your database model to the big wide world who won't understand your business rules. So try to provide whole functionality. This is like, if somebody wants to work with an invoice, allow them to do payments on the invoice. This is in our case. Because just being able to see an invoice is not really that much use. You can see the state of play, but you can't do much else with it. Or you can update it, you can add more elements to it, but you can't do much else. People want to be able to pay their invoices as well. You don't want people who are using your API to start doing this sort of thing. No, it's there, but what do I use it for? It's pointless. Right? Okay. But you also have to think about what you don't want to expose. So, do you really want to expose your database structure or identifiers within your database? A lot of samples which you'll see on that MSDN or you'll see on the internet where people are using web APIs, they'll just expose their database structure and be done with it. And sometimes you don't always want that, especially if you've got sensitive information in there, and then you end up spending more time trying to stop people accessing fields. You might as well end up putting DTOs over the top and then that sort of thing. And also, if you expose your database structure, your API is then already restricted, because for backward compatibility, if you want to change your API, you're going to have to version in order to, if you change your database structure. And you may not want to always do that, and people may want to refactor and work. So it's definitely worth sort of trying to put a layer in between the two, between the outside world. So a bit like an anti-corruption layer, and then you can start running your business rules and all that sort of stuff between your users of your API and your database itself. What technology? I mean, we're all .NET developers here, but in the end, you can write your API in anything you like that you want to support. So it's not technology specific what we do. As long as you can knock up a server which will listen for HTTP requests, and you can have a client which doesn't have to be the same technology that can make HTTP requests, you can use REST. And this is the advantage that's real useful, because you can write your server in one, and you can get clients using it in any platform they want, whether it's in JavaScript, whether it's .NET, PHP, Ruby, Node, well, it says JavaScript again, Node, or Java, or whatever else. We actually use the ASP.NET Web API, and obviously that's just legacy reasons. AccountRight Live itself is a .NET application, and all the business rules and everything else that we want to use are already in .NET, so we just might as well use them. Might as well use .NET there. But I'm not going to discuss about the Web API. There's documentation on MSDN, there's countless videos telling you how to use it. If that's what you want to do, go and look about that. But I'll tell you why we chose it over some other stacks that were available at the time. Or so I'm told, because I wasn't there at the time they chose it, but this is what I was told they chose it. Hosting. We can host in IIS or Azure. We are, from what I understand, one of the largest Azure users in Australia, with many thousands of databases and servers in play in order to host the not just the API but AccountRight itself. And we could also self-host. Now we use self-hosting for when we actually run the API on the desktop. So when people are accessing their AccountRight files that are locally on their own disk, they can use the same API. So they can use the same one in the cloud as they can on the desktop. So it allows people when they're doing integration or development not to just do that sort of development, not to be restricted about what they can do or where those files have to be in order to use the API. Pluggable. Well, it's ASP.NET. You can plug anything you like into it. You can use filters, you can use message handlers, you can use attribute-driven, you could probably throw in showstack, I suppose, if you felt like it. Anything you like. You can just plug anything in there, and you can, the stack, can do all of it. You can modify those messages as they go through the stack. So you can do, obviously, OAuth work, which is what we do, authentication. You can make sure your context is in there and all that sort of stuff. And also you can take advantage of all the wonderful NuGet packages that are out there. Now, I think we're up to about 20 or 30 packages that we've got, just to use anything we can that's out there in order to get the job done. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. But one of the biggest calls that we use is for OData. Now, this has been a blessing and a curse. OData allows you to do queries like this. So it gives you a nice query language that people can use to ask for data out of your system. But it really is designed for people probably using like Entity Framework or Link to SQL, where those queries are going to be all the way down to the database and back. Not so good if you're using an ORM in between and your entities that you've exposed aren't the entities that are in your database or even the same fields. We may have description in the database and it's called name on the outside world. Now, so it means you end up having to do a lot of translations in order to translate the outside world to the inside in order to get those queries to the database. Automatic paging comes in, so we can people can page through pages of the API. So, well, obviously the sample there I didn't do any paging since no need to, I didn't have enough. But we obviously we pull about a default of about 400 entities at a time that people want, with a maximum of 1,000. But that's purely is just a constraint we're putting ourselves, not because there's any restrictions in there. We just didn't want to flood people with masses of information, that they may not want. They may just want a page. But they can control that paging, so they can choose how much they want to show. So if they're doing a web application, they can just page their way through the data. And you get ordering as well for free. And again, that ordering you can either apply straight to the database if you want, or you can, once you've pulled all your entities out of the system, you could use some of the OData tools. He's pointing up at the end. I don't know what he's doing. Okay. Right, okay. You could distracted there. Right, okay. And also there's things like select and expand, which we haven't taken advantage of yet. We thought about it at the time, and we never really could work out what to use them for, but it's mainly because of the design of our entities that we created in the first place. But again, if you want to use that, it's there for free in the Web API.
You have mentioned that you don't want to expose the database structure, but with OData, don't you feel it's going closer towards exposing it?
It would do if that's what we did. What we have is actually a translation layer. So our OData query comes in, and we actually translate that to our database queries. So we've got an ORM behind the scenes, LLBLGen, which obviously, as I said, our fields and our entities in the database do not represent what it is on the outside world. So we've got one field, one table, which carries lots of types of different entities. And we obviously don't want to expose that table as it is. We want to expose it as the subtypes.
So this translation layer, in terms of .NET, what is it? Is it the routing engine or the config file?
No, it's taking the OData EDM model, taking it apart, and then turning those into LLBLGen queries. So with lots of mappings and that sort of stuff, and lots of general mappings. So a lot of handcrafting originally, but over time we learnt the patterns that we needed to, and now it just becomes single statements. So for every element we expose on the outside world, we can map it through to the database with the queries and whatever else, and that's how we write our data for mapping for these queries. So yeah, it's a bit of hard work, but it paid off, because before we'd probably have to pull all the data out of the database and then filter and query that, or for that sort of type, and we didn't want to be doing that all the time, so we started to put the work in to get the data out of the database and do performance. Defining a resource. This will probably cause the biggest arguments. First of all, what's in a name? Use nouns, not verbs. This is the big one of REST, is you name your entities. You don't give verbs. You don't do calculate this and whatever else. Well, that's the Restafarian view, I suppose, the evangelist view. I'm going to say that sometimes you need little services, but it's try to not have as many of them as people would like. Don't have like action equals update whatever else, or action equals modify this as your query strings. Try to just deal with your entities as single entities that you push and post. You get and you put and update. But occasionally you will need sort of services support in order to do things. In our case, we've got like calculate discounts and fees. So we don't know at any point in time what fees are on an invoice, but someone can ask to say, please calculate what it is at this time of day. Then we can work out what to modify the invoice with if we decide to charge somebody fees. But it's not a modification we want to make to the entity itself, because the entity is just so people can render it properly on their side. So that then becomes more of like a service, and we tend then to avoid throw away the REST thing of the same entity going in and out, and just have two different, like a request response. Then it becomes more like a service. But we don't do that often. We really do fight and argue when these business decisions come in. To pluralize or not. I should have probably put that in another tab before I put this. Invoice or invoices. Again, another big debate that had people in rooms arguing for hours. It's your tabs versus spaces debate all over again. I'm assuming we've all been in one of those conversations. Who fell on the side of spaces? Yeah. Who then had an argument over 2 or 4 spaces? Because he's a 2-person over there, I'm a 4-person. So there you go. So it doesn't matter what you do. We're developers. We like to argue over things. Even in the stupid little things we like to argue. And this is another one. And it doesn't really matter about whether you pluralize or not. You'll see different APIs will do it. But you'll find one thing they are is once they've decided on one, they're consistent. And they'll keep with that. One hopes. My argument is how do you deal with something like words like sheep? You start thinking sheeps.
Pieces.
And Mises. I'm not even going to talk about octopus. Sorry? Someone's going to say octopi, someone else is going to say octopuses, aren't they? Or octopodes. So there you go. So there we go. Okay. Identifying a resource. Now this is where we went really wrong in our first version 1. Do you go for human readable ones? So in our case, in tax codes, do we go for a tax code GST for obviously Australia, or S15 for some reason? That is the New Zealand one for their 15% GST. Aren't we lucky? Or do we go for... Sorry? It will be.
Like they have a 17.
Please. Right. Right, or do you go for more machine generated, like your integer, like your database ID, but you may not want to expose your database ID itself directly, or so you may go for a GUI or something else. But one thing you need to make sure is that it's immutable, so that people can store it and cache it and whatever else. And that's where we went wrong on our first version. Because our first version of tax code, of these ones here, like tax code with GST, account, actually the number was immutable, but we found that the GST part, we found somewhere in AccountRight they could edit those things. And so it could be anything they like. And contacts and customers weren't even unique. So it got very difficult to actually pull out a certain entity. So version 1, we realised we just went wrong. The decisions made early on were just not right. So we moved over to version 2. And we just went with GUIDs. People don't like them. People go, I can't type them in and all this sort of stuff. You'd be surprised how many times you will not be typing these in. Computers deal with this most of the time, not humans. So it's not really that to us any worrisome. And if you really want to pick something out by a particular name, whatever else, we've got the OData query language. So you can just do name equals done, and away you go. So yeah, best of both worlds. Okay. Querying. So, how do we get resources by relationship to another resource? So, as I said, we've got the query language, we've got our OData query, but we need to deal with sub-resources. So, do we do things like this? Do we do customer UID invoices to get all the invoices of a customer? Do we get them for all the orders of a customer, or the quotes for a supplier, or the orders for a supplier? Soon starts to get really, really messy when you start to think of this. And again, this is where OData came into its own, because obviously this quickly gets out of control. But we use the query language, we can use the OData filter. Now we can sort of say invoice, done. We can get customer UID by GUID to get the invoices for a customer. We can do the same for orders, for suppliers, or the same for customers on an order. We're hiding the complexity on the other side of the query string, of the question mark inside the query string. And it also cuts down on the number of resources you have. I've seen it done both ways, but again, be consistent, but I prefer this way over the others. As I said, any field you can do then, because anybody can filter on anything in your object model. And obviously there can be fewer endpoints. I think it makes for a cleaner API. So all you can say on here is try to be consistent. Once you've chosen a pattern of how to represent your resources, stick with it, especially when you come finding your identifiers or querying your data. Versioning. This is going to cause arguments as well. Yeah, we've had teams who sat in rooms for afternoons because one team didn't want to do it because we have essentials exposing stuff and Cashbook and obviously AccountRight Live. We were lucky, we were first, we got to choose. They have to stick with it. So, there is one way, however, to version. If I say which one we chose, some people like to do /v1 thingy. You'll see these on resources. People quite like this version. It's not very, it goes against the REST way of doing things though. But it is easy to do and a lot of people do it. And a lot of the arguments we had in our place were to do with, well, that's what Google do or that's what Facebook do. It doesn't mean because they do it is the right thing to do, but it's part of the query string. Put the complexity on the other side of the question mark. I think that makes life a little bit easier. Or in the headers. This is actually the more restful way of doing things. Or according to scripture, I suppose I think, the rest scripture. Probably putting in headers is the best way of doing it, it's the right way of doing it. We actually went with headers first, and then we had some holdouts, so then we also supported the question mark one as well. So, but why not? You can do both ways. It doesn't mean you have to do both. Yeah?
Version 1 versus version 2, are they actually separate code bases, or are they same code base and there's lots of additional bits based on?
No, they're actually separate. So, as I said, we had made a lot of problems with version 1, just mapping the data and whatever else. So we just split, and we just have something that works out which direction to go based on controllers and whatever else. The entities we had all changed, and obviously being generics and all this sort of thing, it was easier just to split and just work with it that way. And we just used a NuGet package, which I think SDAM versioning, I can't remember exactly the thing. Oh, sorry. And it's got some switches in there where you can actually configure it to version based on the header or whatever else, and then it works out the right controller based on name and the version and all this sort of stuff. So it did the work for us, really. So, okay. Sorry? As little as possible. We have a lot of holdout. Once people have done integrations, they don't want to do another integration. As I said, we still put, even 2 years, well, it's 18 months on now, we're still supporting version 1. We don't do any new functionality in there if we can avoid it. We sometimes, when we do some refactoring, we may have to rework stuff, but we try to avoid changing any of the work in there because it's obviously backward compatibility of people as well. But we still support version 1. Version 2, all we do is we add extra resources that are in there, but they're still in the version 2 namespace. It does mean that if somebody tries to access a later resource that is not yet exposed for their version of the company file, then we sort of just have to turn around and say it's just not available, not found. So we use the HTTP to say it's just not there, not available.
Do you have ways that you could monitor a particular resource to see how quickly eventually just drop back?
Yeah.
Or request a particular resource on a version and say it's not being asked for anymore.
The disadvantage we have there is that on the cloud we can do that, but on the desktop we have no idea who's doing this on the desktop. And unfortunately a lot of our integrations are on the desktop. So we do not know who these people are, we do not know what they're doing. All we know is that if we break stuff, then we get to hear about them. We get to find out who they are. And then they're very quick to get in touch. The final version one I've seen, and this was, I do like this way of doing it, but it's not very, well, it's becoming more popular, it's very RESTful, where you actually merge both your representation that you want to represent out, like JSON or XML, with the version of the entity that you actually want to ask for. And this sort of describes a lot about what, to me, a resource is when people are asking for a version or a representation, whether it's XML or JSON or version 1 or version 2. It's the same resource. It's not a different resource. It's the same one. It's just a different format. So when you're asking for an invoice, whether it's in XML, JSON, or PDF, it's the same invoice. So why not hide it all in there? We obviously use the content type and accept headers in order for people to use that instead, to choose what format they want it in, use a header or query string to choose the version. But again, we also allow people to choose the content type on the other side of the query string as well. It's mainly people using the desktop build will do this, and if they're talking from Excel, apparently. So yeah, that will happen. Okay. Data structure. Right. What should go into your data? Best way is to look at one of our things. Version 1. This is our tax code. As I said, everything about this we hated after we'd released and realised that's not what we wanted to be doing anymore. We've got an ID down the bottom there. Got an ID down there, which we found was obviously people could change. So it wasn't very immutable. We got that row version thing, which I'm talking about, the optimistic locking, because we didn't want people just splatting over the top. We wanted to make sure they knew what they were updating. But that was an enforced business requirement. Didn't want to do it, but had no choice. We didn't have any hypermedia links in there. We see these links to accounts, whatever else, and it looked a bit messy, and we didn't like it. Did not like it at all. So when we went to version 2, it started to look like this. Yeah, it's a bit more expressive. But we also tried to cut down, if we go back to version 1, if anybody wanted to know more about that account, they had to then go and query that account. So it ended up becoming a very chatty API as well when people wanted to work with it. So when we went to version 2, we tried to cut down on that chattiness. So if somebody wanted to find out more about an account, we got the name and the display ID there, we've got the GUID, we've got the link to the GUID. Ignore the domain CF GUID there because that'll just stretch it right out. And also, if people just wanted to render it, they can show what the account name is or what its display ID is without actually make another query. So it cuts down on the chattiness, which is good for us because it eases the stress on the servers. So we tried to deliver more data, but to cut down on noise. Okay. Validation. Yeah. RICE. Now, this actually has a meaning, and unfortunately Emad's not here. And who was going to come here? Who would have got this joke? There you go. RICE came out of one of our retros. When we did validation, we realised we got it mostly wrong. So how do we tell people what when things were wrong? We were just returning information from our business backend, and it was talking about entities and fields, which nobody knew what the hell they were. And so we spent best part of 3 months where 80% of our time was rewriting all that validation layer and translating all those messages that the backend system was generating and turning them into something usable. And it got nicknamed RICE, only because it's boring but good for you. Okay, so now you've got the context. Obviously, you return validation as 400 status codes. We all know that. That's how you deal with bad requests. Okay, and we try to be expressive as possible. So when we say, I probably should have had what it probably used to look like before there, because it probably would have just turned back with quantity required, or would have turned that. It probably said required. It probably would have said quantity ID. Wouldn't have told you which line it was or anything like that. Now we've got it such that when it returns an error, not only does it tell you what fields are, and you can have more than one error in a blob as well, but it'll tell you what line was the error on to help the developer who's using your API not go to the forums or send emails to your customer support team, so they can see exactly where they went wrong and deal with it. So one thing to definitely take from it is make sure you get your validation right, because otherwise you'll have a lot of, if your API takes off and your validation is awful, they will be on you and they'll be wasting more of your time and you will not be doing your project. Okay. Supporting the API. The other side of obviously having an API is you have to support it. Now, we're quite lucky is that we had a customer support team. But what we wanted is our customer support team not to have to respond to everybody with this sort of email. Developers aren't always the best at giving bug reports, and we'll get a lot of it doesn't work, and you want to avoid this being your first response to people. So how did we go about even just supporting an API? As I said, we have a customer support team. They'd already been used to supporting the ODBC driver, but now they're having to learn a new paradigm as well. So we had to try and do a lot of education, not only of our existing developer partners who are using ODBC, but they also have to educate the new people coming in who are very web friendly, but they just wanted to get going. So documentation. We document a lot, so the account documentation is quite heavy. We did try tools like Swagger and even tried rolling our own tools in-house, but they never seem to work for us because we all know developers hate write documentation. So anything that involves developers writing inline documentation in code or trying to attribute stuff up just wasn't happening. And also most developers can't spell. So you will find that you really want someone who knows what they're doing to represent it all up. And so they actually made it look pretty. I thought I was going to zoom in nicer. Zoom into that if I can. Wrong way. So we've got obviously telling them a lot more about what's going on. We can explain about all the different fields that are in there. We give them sample JSON, which some people actually cut and paste and send back straight into the system and wonder why it doesn't work. And also there's links obviously to all of the other resources down the side here as well. So if I can zoom into there as well, there we go. So obviously that's what, and we've namespaced everything as well, so people can find various pieces of functionality and that sort of thing. But as I say, we always try to be consistent wherever we can. So, okay. Yes. Yeah, we did, as I said, we did try auto-generating it and whatever else, and it just became, we spent more time on the auto-generation tools sometimes than actually on the resources. Because then people go, I want to do this now. Oh, here we go, another card on the wall, and away it goes. And we ended up throwing loads of code away because when we decided, you know what, let's just do it this way. We had a guy, PHP guy, and he tapped away, and he was quite happy doing this sort of thing. And so, you know, and also when you get the customer support team to type it all in and learn it all as well, they learn through typing it all in. And when it comes to questions as well, they hardly ever have to come talk to a developer because they understand it, because they've had to write all these and they understand all the different business rules involved. I'm not saying that's the way why you should do it. I'm just saying that's just what worked for us. Okay. Forums. We also have a lot of forums. So we have obviously developer forums. Is that any more on there? Yeah. There we go. So yeah, we also have forums on here. So we have people come and ask questions. You can see obviously messages from thing there. Me responding. Can't remember why I responded, but I did. Hey? No. Think about Stack Overflow. How many people have actually gone to Stack Overflow? They have the question answered for them, and then they go, oh, thank you very much. Yeah, you'll get that everywhere else. I did actually query some of these because obviously when I was actually writing the presentation, I wanted to find out why some of them hadn't been answered. And what happens is somebody will post it on the forum, and then they'll send an email because they didn't get an instant forum message in response, at 6 o'clock in the evening. And then the conversation takes place via email. And the guys just don't get round to pasting the conversation into here because obviously they don't know what bits to paste or mark it as solved, whatever else. So I was a bit worried there wasn't things solved, but apparently they had solved them as well. So I did query that. And as I said, Stack Overflow. Strangely, developers seem to think Stack Overflow is the help desk for everything. And you'll find questions on Stack Overflow for your system. I found it for my open source projects. I found it for other ones. They'll go to Stack Overflow thinking, rather than go to the place where they got the tool from. And it drives me potted. I don't understand it. I can understand if the community had died around it, but if it's something's active, they should go there. My particular favourite, and this is if I do not wish to embarrass this developer, but I might do. You can probably go and slate him. I don't know who Tim Long is. I hope he's not in the room. But he wants to know how you build an IEnumerable in the loop. There you go. There you go. So your developers that you'll be using can range from really good and you don't hear from them to those who need hand-holding. Unfortunately, you'll hear a lot from them. So you really want to make this as easy as possible, so you don't hear as much from them as you might if your documentation or your support around that was not so good. So I said, embrace the community. An SDK. We actually host an SDK. We've written our own SDK. I use the SDK is used here on the phone. It's .NET SDK, it's .NET 3.5, 4, 4.5, portable, all that sort of stuff, using all the little NuGet packaging features. And it's very useful because a lot of developers, don't like working, especially when it's just very cruddy type of work. We actually use the SDK ourselves in our own BDD test suite as well, so it gets really heavily hit before it even reaches the light of day on the customers. When we post up a new version, we've already tested it for the past 3 months. It's already been hammered out, especially around new entities that we're exposing and new services and new behaviours. And new features that we know, such as like being able to pull a PDF or whatever else. It's all done through the SDK. You can just all get it as PDF and it'll just pull it. So quite nice. Saves a lot of effort. Unfortunately, we've only done it for .NET, so any PHP guys, Ruby guys, and whatever else run around. We also have, obviously, samples. And we put, obviously that's the SDK there, sorry. The source code all available on GitHub. Warts and all. How sometimes not to write async await was how Shaun did it, fish stuff. Good. That's lucky, because I had Daniel around and he sorted me out. So, I should have spent a little bit more time on MSDN, but there you go. But luckily that package didn't see the light of day. But that's why we have BDD tests and end-to-end tests. So, samples. We post samples up on GitHub. This is a Windows mobile sample, which is the one on here, showing how to do that. So again, developers can come along. There's the samples. Here's how to use the API on the .NET platform. If you can read a bit of .NET code, you should be able to translate that into your code domain. One hopes, that most of us can read at least more than one language and not get panicked out by that. And put them in other languages as well. We'll put a Node one up there. Just to give an idea of how to go about doing it in another language, just because people sometimes don't want to see two variations of doing the same thing, it will click. I think we've got PHP samples up there as well, as I said, because we've got a PHP guy and he likes to write those ones. Okay. And then contributions. We did actually get some contributions. Some person even wrote a Ruby API for us. That's a nice one. I quite like that. I've never used it. I don't know how well it works, but there's a little community of them all talking amongst themselves on there, and I'm not being involved. And they all sit there putting up issues and requests, and they're dealing with each other's requests, and it's quite nice. And just let them get on with it. It's quite nice. We don't hear from them. And logging. Logging is probably one of the things we don't do very well as developers. But when you're supporting API in the cloud, you're going to have to deal with issues that things are just going to go wrong. Whether it's people saying, I keep getting this error, I'm getting a validation error, and I can't work out what the problem is, and it's probably because we've just had bad messages coming back, or they get a 500 because they've sent us something we just weren't expecting. And that we just haven't handled properly, and we really need to put better validation in there to support that. And so log everything. And then put it into a tool you can do something with. There's no good in a log file on its own. We actually use Splunk there, and we're also looking at Logstash as well. We're using Splunk primarily. And we can use the same log files to produce lots of different reports. So on this one here, I'm using the same log files to monitor the scaling in Azure. Now you wonder why I don't look at Azure. Well, I'm a dev and the product team are over there and they don't let us see their portals. So I wrote my own reporting to see how the scaling was going. So, I could do all that through the logging. I didn't think I knew I could do that through the logging, but there you go. If I log enough information, I can see what I like. I can see how many responses we're seeing going through. This was sometime today. So we're getting, I don't do this as a logarithmic, so I can see how many times I'm getting 200s, 201s, how many people get validation errors, no 500s, which is always good. Sorry?
I was thinking of outcome.
Well, it's amazing because if I'd shown you this probably 2 weeks ago, we released something which had lots of 500s, and it was just a complete muck-up on our behalf, where we just forgot to put we somehow accidentally deleted a validation rule, and we didn't realise it, and we didn't have a test in place, which is very bad of us. But and that obviously the system caught it up with 500s. Nothing went wrong other than the 500s. So once we've realised what it was, we put the validation rule back in, made sure there was a test there for it, and move forward. So yeah, but you can use this sort of stuff. And being a developer, being able to access these sort of things means that we can respond to them quickly before waiting for a developer to tell us there's a problem. Especially if they're using like a service to do the work and they're not handling it properly themselves. So the one that we saw was somebody who just had a service sending us lots of data, but they weren't checking their own response code, and so they were just trying again and again and again and again, and they just didn't stop for weeks. Well, not for weeks, for the best part of a week, until we actually managed to get the patch out and push it up into the cloud, and then it stopped, and then they got 400s. But at least then, hopefully they dealt with it, and if they didn't, I didn't care anymore because I don't log 400s. Or I don't care about them as much. We can track the errors, so I look at 409s. And I can also have a look at throughput, see how many messages going through overall, all from the same log files. So using something like Splunk or whatever else is quite good, in my opinion. So, questions, I think, hopefully not too long, and maybe that. Okay.
Tokens. How does the client transfer token? Again, in a header.
All right, so yeah, this is the bit I actually missed out, and I realised this about half an hour ago. I kept thinking to myself, what did I miss? Security and authentication. Now, it's up to you. To me, that's a concern outside of your API, but it's quite important for a lot of people. We actually use OAuth 2 in the cloud. On the desktop, they just need to provide enough to get through their own company file credentials, because each company file on the desktop has their own credentials. You just saw that admin screen. Mm-hmm. So for us in the cloud, there's 2 logins, which is a bit of a pain. There is cards to try and deal with that. But because normally there is a OAuth token, which gives you access to all your company files that you have access to, but each one of those could have a unique username and password. A different one for each company file, because you could have one for, if you're an accountant's office, you could have one for, Dick Smith's, another one for MYOB, well, not MYOB, but for MYO or whatever, know what I mean. And these have their own usernames and passwords that they would use to log into each of those files, which are separate to their OAuth token. So we don't tie them completely together, and it's represents on how we do things. So we use, as I said, tokens. We use the bearer token on OAuth in the cloud. So that's about all it is.
What's the expiration?
Sorry?
What's the expiration period you set it for?
It stays in the token.
Yeah, but what's...
It's purely up to the DevOps team when they tweak it, because they can tweak it. Sometimes it's 20 minutes, sometimes it's 5, depending on what it is they're playing around with.
Backend service, how is the service? Service has to go up and load requesting the token.
Yeah, and that's more the same. But there's a refresh token, so they don't have to log in every time. And then there's also things like dev keys, which is an alternative thing that sits on top of that as well. And again, that's like a piece of supporting infrastructure for your API. And if you're going to try and charge for it, or you want to control access by dev key, or what people can do as well. But again, we purely just use dev key for logging. We don't use it much for controlling or throttling. So, yeah.
Why did you choose Web API over any of the other .NET API?
As I said, that decision was made before I started the project. At the very beginning, they wanted, maybe because it was .NET 4.5 and it was new and improved, and people were talking about it at the time. People on the project themselves were actually doing talks on Web API, so they were quite fanboys of it, I suppose. It fitted in with the MVC4. It came out the tin. You press the button, things happened, and it got the OData support and all that sort of thing. So yeah, but
have you ever considered moving to any other frameworks, or
I am, yes, but only because there's in the cloud. There are issues that we've had with the Web API, not with the infrastructure itself, but just the tie-in that we've got with our various support. And in the cloud, obviously, as we're moving to even more distributed than we are already, microservices frame infrastructure. So, and that will allow us to then separate the piece that does the routing of the information that comes in, and then we can use whichever stack we like. Could even be Node for all we like. And that will then send the information on to the appropriate processing engine behind the scenes. So again, we can separate all that out. But at the moment, we've got quite a tight coupling as we're slowly separating that out, and then that gives us that freedom to shift to whatever we like.
It's pretty much a stuff where the API is around all of the same business.
It is, yeah. Yeah, it's really is just takes the information in, makes sure it just validates everything, make sure people have supplied all the right fields, takes advantage of validation framework and that sort of stuff, and then it just delivers it to behind the scenes. So it's very thin. We don't spend much time in the web API at all.
I saw that in the Splunk you had a graph of number of response or number of requests that were made to your system.
Yeah.
How do you decide on the instances you need to fire up? Like, is it some magic number, like 1,000 instances?
No, on that one there's obviously 5 instances. It's normally done in Azure. They've got a auto-scaling setup, and the products guys deal with that. I don't deal with that side of things at all. I know they do it based on processor sort of thing, but I couldn't tell you exactly the numbers they're using. But they've been playing around with the API and tweaking how many instances they need for obviously charge, compared to obviously the input, the amount of data coming in. And they seem to be able to manage that quite effectively. Yeah, too many. Go on, Judy.
So you guys built a C# SDK?
We do.
Right. And you made a decision not to build another one? Work in some way?
We had no call for it.
But somebody built a Ruby SDK?
Somebody built a Ruby SDK. And we're quite
clearly there is a call for it.
Well, there is, yes.
Is that a decision that someone thought about, or is it just something that was too hard and we couldn't bother doing it?
It's mainly we had no driver for it at the time ourselves. Internally, yeah. I said the initial SDK actually came from me messing around with a phone app to use it for an internal demo.
Okay.
And now that code then just got pulled out of there from a spike, from a hack day sort of thing.
Okay.
Then, and so we just get around. We have a Ruby team who are actually doing stuff with PayDirect and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, okay.
But again, they're doing their own stuff, but they haven't exposed that sort of it out to the big wide world. That's up to them. There was talk of people doing a Node SDK as well. And we got excited by them doing that, and we never heard about them doing that. So, but again, it's really up to people to decide whether they want to. We didn't want to do more than one SDK. We had no call for it ourselves.
Yeah.
And most of our developers are .NET developers.
Yeah.
Just
but
pure.
Because you've got a .NET SDK?
No, most of them were coming from the VB background, so we're dragging them up. Yes, sorry.
So some of the Azure teams also generate their SDKs for other languages like Node and Ruby and Python.
Yes.
And some of that tooling probably get open source quite soon.
Yeah.
So
We may look at that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have sort of looked at that, and we also looked at using the API, the Azure API sort of support as well. But again, it just didn't work for us. It's too restrictive based on what our entities look like and how we wanted to document them and how we wanted to express our API. So we had to sort of make a decision in the end. So, sorry.
I was going to ask, you made minor changes to the API within a version, or is it fixed and adding extra properties in the response?
Yes. We do sometimes extend a response when we go to a later version of the company files. The funny thing about AccountRight Live is that we support about 3 different schemas in the cloud, or sometimes 4. And obviously that brings its own challenges, because obviously sometimes we have a database in an early version which doesn't even have a field that they can modify, and in a later version it's obviously there. And so we have to deal with all sorts of weird behaviours. We've done some horrible stuff around serialization and all that to handle that sort of stuff. But our mission to obviously break up the API and to remove that tight coupling between the contracts between the different layers, we can then obviously get away from that. But that's it's an ongoing progress, but that's more of a technical challenge rather than an API itself. But it's a side effect of how just MYOB works in the cloud. So.
Yeah, what strategies do you have to take in the asynchronous or long-running operation if you have to deal at all?
There is one thing that we've been looking at, which is obviously we have had this conversation in the past for doing certain operations, and that resource, the card for that resource always keeps dropping down the list because no one can actually say, oh, we want to do that? No, we don't. Well, we want to do that? No, we don't. But we're probably going to take an approach very similar to Splunk when they sort of do their queries, where they send a request in to do some form of action or do some form of update or normally around long-running queries. And then they'll get a token back and they can then query to get the state of it and just poll away. And we've also got cards in the system as well, which are probably going to come up quite quickly as well to get these notifications out so people can start using webhooks and that sort of stuff. So we've been around all the houses, tried all the different and looked at all the different approaches. But at the moment we are developing very much in an agile fashion, so whatever we go with what people are demanding most out of us now, and we are not getting, until recently, demand for people wanting to get notifications. So,
how that breaks rest.
And
how that works in pure rest.
Well, the other thing also, we've got to work out how our cloud works as well, because we've got two systems here. We've got obviously AccountRight itself with its own infrastructure. With its own infrastructure and messaging. And then we've got obviously the API as well, and both of them need to sort of synchronize. Now, also, they've got a database to do that synchronization between. But when it comes to notifications, you want someone to set a notification over here. Well, they don't know where the notification's been done and who's even made that message, but they've got to route them all to the right places and then get those engines going. So it's going to be a big infrastructure challenge to do with that. So somebody over there, I believe. Yes?
Change anything from working sites?
Not at the moment, no. People can control that obviously by controlling on how much information they select. We support compression, so people can control that as well. So that cuts down on the size of data in a packet. And obviously but we have, again, the things about the select in OData. We haven't used it, but that's one of the ways we will probably control that. But be surprised, it's actually quite light. So, yeah.
Usually have issues with our API sort of falling behind functional development applications, so certain fields are missing and so forth.
Yeah.
How do you find that you try and keep the API up to date as much of the application, assuming there's probably some separate functionality that kind of is the URLs or API for?
Yeah. No, that's definitely a challenge. Luckily, we've only been really exposing an API on an existing project. So most of that development and those resources are already well known and fairly solid and aren't changing. But it has raised its question. That question has been raised recently with people now making changes in certain areas to stuff we've already exposed. Our mission is to make the API everybody's job. Because currently the API has been a core team, and we've just been exposing resources and hosting the infrastructure and all that sort of thing. And now we're trying to make it everybody's responsibility, so that when they start talking about I'm going to modify accounts or I'm going to modify invoices, they also have to look at the impact on the API themselves. And I've also made sure that all the code that they need to deal with is in their branch. So they can't escape. They can't say I don't know what it looks like. The code is there. They can modify it. They can see it. They can query it. They can use all the tooling.
Have you thought about using PayDirect API, public API being your external API?
We do use it. Also for PayDirect uses it, and again the dog fooding side of things is probably going to start kicking off again. This is probably the API that we exposed. There have been APIs in the past that the main product uses, and you have to remember the main product of AccountRight itself is actually a desktop software which talks over the cloud, the internet to the cloud, and it uses its own mechanisms for doing that. So it's obviously a big change to obviously rewrite some of those screens to start to use the API to do that. But again, that is obviously that's part of a journey that we have yet to take. It's it's that murky land, far off land that we're still heading towards. And I say the journey's not over. It'll be going on for a long time. So maybe even version 3. Even though I ever say version 3, my product manager panics. So because he doesn't want to actually communicate that to any dev partners. So.
Do you support any actions against resources, or do you only like look to whole object?
We tend to only we do it in a very REST way. So it is only put, post, delete, use those verbs against those sort of entities. When we do have actions, we then expose them as more of a service, and we use like a verb to describe that. So like calculate discounts and fees. So we actually, it's very obvious. It's more of a service-like action, but they tend to also be those sort of services don't actually affect anything in the system. They're just doing some work and then returning data. There's nothing being stored behind them. I'm trying to think if I can think of any of our. I didn't develop all the resources, so I can't remember what they all do. So yeah, so, yeah. Let's get to that. Sorry,
Maybe just one or two more, and then.
Okay. There's the fellow. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, how do you observe the errors? Do you do the target and have exceptions, or is it some filter that you're using on this action result, or are you making it in a config file?
Sorry, can you run? What's the first bit? How do I?
You don't throw the stack trace. You have that structure for the error. You have error code.
Oh yes, yeah. Okay. It depends, obviously, what we're doing. Most of it, if it's a validation error, we defend in depth, in layers. So we've got validation, which defends on the contract itself. So it's like the first entry come in. If we don't like it, we just throw it straight out. We then defend another layer where we try and get as many error messages. So say, they've put a customer and tried to request a customer UID, which doesn't even exist in their database. So we can validate at that level and throw out. And then we've got the business rules that once we actually try to sort of push an invoice into the system itself has got its own set of business rules as well. And then when they throw out, we have to translate them. And then obviously those messages usually thrown by exception out of the system. But that's mainly because of a structure that we have. And then it's normally caught by, as you say, action filters or message handlers of the stack. And then that gets translated into the appropriate messages on the wire. But yeah, there's many ways to solve the problem, but that's the approach we chose. And there's one more, I believe, yes?
Do you namespace the services differently? Like URLs for those, are they related to entities or generally just,
Unfortunately, yes. Yeah, we do have that with version 1 and version 2, they are all namespaced differently. So, and that's obviously as I said, that NuGet package we use, the SDAM versioning package. Actually, you can choose that to pick out the header, put a number into it, and then say what the name of the entity is that they're after, and then it will find the appropriate controller for us. So we just then extended that to do what we wanted. So, and yeah, we are bound by some form of contracts at the moment, which again is one of the things to moving away. That once we've pulled a lot of this code and decoupled everything, it means then we can, get rid of the web API, or if we wanted to at that front end and use something different there, because a lot of the processing of the OData and everything else actually happens deeper down the system nowadays. So it all happens quite deep down. We've gone through several layers. You've routed to the same controller, and that's when the OData kicks in and all those sorts of queries. So they can still do what they want to do where they are. Okay.